OK, let's take a closer look at some of the stories that are catching our eye and behind the headlines. It's been 5 years since that historic Brexit vote, but Britain's Mirror newspaper reports there would be a different result today if that poll was held again. Now, this is the last front page of Hong Kong's largest pro-democracy paper, Apple Daily, which is being forced to close following China's crackdown in the city. The Economic Times is reporting that India says it's discovered a new strain of the highly infectious Delta variant. It's known as Delta Plus, and at least 40 cases have been reported. And the news website Flipboard has more on a decision by America's biggest bank, which could set a standard for others. JP Morgan says it's only allowing employees back if they can show they've been vaccinated. Well, my reviewers today are the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani and political editor at the Sunday Mirror, Nigel Nelson. Thanks to you both for joining us. Nigel, if I can start with you, what are your observations, starting with Brexit, 5 years after Britain voted to leave?
Well, what this poll is showing is that we're pretty much as divided as ever. Although the result will be different, the idea that 51% would have remained and 49 left is not so very different from previously, when we had 48% remainers and 52% wanting to leave. I think that what we've discovered in the last year or so is that Brexit has not been a complete disaster, not the disaster that the Remainers were predicting. But the trouble is, it's been so overshadowed by COVID, we still don't know the effects. Now, we know there's a problem in Ireland because that's where we've got our border, our land border with the EU. We know that some ports have got 72-hour delays there. And there's industries like hairdressing, hospitality, haulage. These are industries that use an awful lot of EU workers who are struggling to find staff. I mean, the haulage industry alone, we're talking about 65,000 truck drivers that they're missing. What we don't know is whether they've gone home because they want to be with their families because of COVID, or they've gone home because of Brexit.
Yeah, Nabila, what do you make of the intervening 5 years? Do you think enough has changed for people to change their opinions, or do you think little has changed?
Well, the first thing I would say is I can't believe it's only 5 years since the Brexit referendum. It feels like we've been talking about this subject all our lives, and the only thing that took our minds away from it was the coronavirus pandemic. But I think what is certain is that the 2016 referendum was never going to be conclusive, and we would be talking about Britain's EU membership pretty much forever. And this latest poll might suggest that the British would now stay in Europe if they could. But the result, as Nigel said, is as close as it was in 2016, albeit with Remain now winning. But we're talking about a win margin of 2 or 3%, which many sensible people would say is not enough, especially when you're dealing with such a massive issue. And if you're going to create a huge amount of work, and indeed discord, then it might be worth ruling that the win margin needs to be at least 10%. And as it is, the reality is that Britain seems to be divided by around 50-50 as to whether it wants to be.
Yeah, I mean, very little chance of going back to to that poll now. Do you think other Europeans, Nabila, are watching to see how Britain fares outside the bloc and possibly willing to consider their own nation's exit if it works well for the UK?
I think what most people are observing is that the stark reality is that Britain has to have a relationship with the EU, whatever happens. And it will never leave in the pure sense. And instead, it will be renegotiating with the EU, constantly trying to do the best it can while not technically belonging to the club. And that said, Britain has voted for the Conservative Party, which can be very much called the architect of Brexit. It has been voted for that party constantly since 2016. So perhaps that is a far better indication of what the British people think, rather than referendums or indeed opinion polls. And it has to be said that Boris Johnson is a Conservative politician who stacked his entire career on Brexit. And he might seem very unpopular at times, but he comfortably wins elections and clearly has a massive, strong base. And I don't doubt that he's in. That he will. I think. In fact, I doubt very much that he's in the mood to offer any referendums at the moment. He certainly doesn't want to give the Scottish, for example, another one about independence in the short term. And his predecessor, David Cameron, said that the in-out vote of 2016 would be a one in a lifetime one.
Yeah, I was surprised also by the poll that most Europeans would welcome us back. That surprised me. But moving on, news that Hong Kong's pro-democracy AntiBeijing newspaper is being forced to close over security fears and financial pressures. You're both journalists. Nigel, how devastating is this?
Well, I mean, very. I mean, Apple Daily was the standard bearer of the pro-democracy movement, and now it's being closed down effectively by the new security law that Beijing has brought in Hong Kong. And for security law, read unacceptable censorship. The law is effectively criminalizing criticism, and the paper has to close because they fear for the safety of their staff, which is no way to run a country that was meant to be allowed the freedoms that China hadn't got. I mean, that was the deal we had when Hong Kong went back to China from Britain in 1997. I mean, the real tragedy of this, I think, and the real tragedy for free speech, is that there's not anything we can do about it, that the world wrings its hands, they issue strong words, but nothing actually happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear, isn't it, Nabila, that any criticism of Beijing is not going to be allowed in the new Hong Kong.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with what Nigel just said. And this is indeed a very sinister story as far as the freedom of the media is concerned. Apple Daily has been hugely important to democracy campaigners in Hong Kong for a long time, but its offices were raided following trumped-up claims that it had breached a very controversial national security law, and hundreds of police were involved, and they arrested editors.
And it's not just an assault on free press, is it? I mean, it's on all freedoms, right? We're seeing this play out on not just, on the streets with pro-democracy protesters jailed, with anti-Beijing politicians not being allowed to stand in elections. It's an assault on all civil liberties.
Absolutely, and they say that when a regime starts to arrest journalists, then democracy as a whole is in a very perilous situation, and that seems to be the case here. And colleagues of those arrested are already saying that Apple Daily staff fear for their safety, so they are clearly being massively intimidated. And sadly, there's nothing surprising in all this either. Jimmy Lai, the founder of Apple Daily, is pretty much a lifelong critic of the Chinese Communist Party, and he's already in jail on a string of charges. And Apple Daily has been a beacon of media freedom in the Chinese-speaking world, and it's widely supported by political dissidents in Hong Kong. But now we can expect a verbal condemnation of what has happened from all over the world. But sadly, there's often very little that can be done to those clamping down on media freedom.
Yeah, I mean, Nigel, I mean, were we all naive to think after that 1997 handover that one part of China would be so different from another?
Well, we were obviously naive to believe them because that's exactly what they said, that it would be different. And certainly before the pro-democracy movement started, the last time I went to Hong Kong was a different place. Now it seems to be having to follow exactly the same rules as mainland China. Now, that's a breach of the treaty. But as Nabila said, as I said earlier, there isn't an awful lot you can do about it. China is too powerful. Sanctions aren't going to work, and that will ruin trade deals we all want to do with China. So at the moment, we have to sit here and watch these things going on, and there's nothing we can do to stop it.
Yeah, OK, well, moving on to, what would be a behind the headlines without COVID as well? A new variant's been discovered in India. We now have Delta Plus. Nigel, tell us more about this.
Well, they found 40 cases of this new variant in India. We've now, in the UK, we've already found 41 cases. All I'm going to say is so far, the scientists don't seem to be unduly worried about what is happening. But obviously, variants are a concern to us all. I mean, the big problem is going to be what happens if a variant comes along which can evade the vaccine, which is why it's so important to get the world vaccinated so variants can't develop. Now, when I've been talking to vaccine manufacturers, what they're saying is the big hope is going to be booster jabs that are coming along shortly. They will be tweaked rather like the flu vaccine is every year, and they should be able to deal with the variants. But at the moment, it's kind of fingers crossed.
Yeah, Nabila, that's the issue, isn't it? It will keep mutating. The science is going to have to keep up with it. We just have to get on with it, don't we?
Yes, and I think what this story shows is that we are generally enjoying a time of great optimism in the fight against coronavirus in the West, with vaccination programs working very well and infection rates dropping significantly. However, the statistics from India, which show cases of the Delta Plus variant across large areas, they are very worrying indeed, and they show that the world is by no means out of the woods yet. And India has been hit horrifically by COVID-19 in recent months, and this looks like more of the same in a number of states. And the Delta variant has caused devastation, and now Delta Plus is what is known as a variant of concern. So this is, of course, jargon to describe how the virus keeps mutating to cope with defenses so as to attack communities, and variants become more severe and indeed easier to transfer. And the biggest fear is that Delta Plus will cause a new wave in India and indeed threaten other parts of the world, as Delta did. And I think what this all shows is that coronavirus is not going anywhere. And we really need to focus on mass vaccination and other means of combating the virus. And a big issue will also be documentation in a massively shrinking world. And it is about, this brings us to, of course, the related question of vaccine passports, something that could prove very important for a country the size of India and one that is interconnected with the rest of the world.
I mean, you mentioned the vaccine documentation. Now, rather controversially, America's biggest bank, JP Morgan, is instructing US staff to register their vaccine status on an internal web portal this week. What are your thoughts on this, Nigel?
Well, I think this is rather sensible. I'm totally against the idea of forcing people to be vaccinated just to go and do their job. That seems to be a step too far. I'm not against people proving vaccination status if they want to do something voluntary, like go to a restaurant or a pub or a theatre or a cinema or something like that. Now, what JP Morgan have done, unlike their biggest rival Morgan Stanley, which actually is forcing workers to get jabbed, they're saying, look, if you can come in and prove you've had 2 doses of the vaccine, you can come to work and you won't have to wear a mask. Now, that seems to be the way forward, is to persuade people to have the vaccine rather than force them to do so. And of course, that will reassure other workers that the workplace is safe. They've got about 25% staffing at the moment. From July the 19th, they're going to have an awful lot more. And this seems to be the way that companies should go to encourage people to turn up fully jabbed.
Do you agree, Nabila, that this is the way companies should go?
Yes, indeed. I actually think this is extremely logical and not in the least bit controversial. I think employees who have what JP Morgan is saying, I mean, if you put it in the context of what major banks are obsessed about, they are absolutely obsessed with protecting their assets. the assets, and it doesn't surprise me at all to see major ones like JP Morgan instructing their staff to register their vaccine status. Now, employees who have had 2 anti-coronavirus jabs will be allowed to discard face masks at work and generally get on with their lives in the way they did before the pandemic. And this is clearly desirable, especially if you accept that we are not all safe until everyone is safe. And the only way we will know if everyone is safe is if we communicate with each other. And there is nothing new in this either. It would be perfectly normal to tell people you have had an anti-malaria vaccination in other parts of the world, for example. And staff at JP Morgan will be allowed to tick a box saying they would rather not disclose their status. But I guess this would obviously mean that they had not bothered with the vaccination. And that's their choice. Since they are threatening their own health and that of their colleagues, then of course other people should be allowed to know this. But this doesn't mean that they will lose their jobs. It would effectively mean that they would have to continue with social distancing, wearing a mask, and the like. And if that's the life they chose and they want to call this freedom, then that's up to them.
Nigel, do you think we could see more companies, restaurants, airlines all going this way, this sort of being the new normal?
Yes, I think it will be the new normal, at least for the time being. So what you're going to see is COVID passports. You had a report earlier, which is the COVID passport that's going to be introduced in Europe on July the 1st. And there you're proving your vaccine status, whether you've had a negative test, whether you've had COVID. These are the kind of things I think that we're all going to have to carry. Fairly simple on an iPhone. I've got no problem with that. If I want to go somewhere, like go to the pub, and the landlord wants to see my vaccine status, I've no objection to showing him.
You don't go to the pub, do you, Nigel?
Well, the vote will be looked at.
Thanks to you both. Thanks to both of my guests, Nabila Ramdani and Nigel Nelson. Thank you. That's this edition of Behind the Headlines.